So today we are starting Unit 6, which is the circulatory system. We have this divided into three different parts. Part 1 will be all about blood. Part 2 is all about the heart. And then part 3 is really just a teeny tiny little snippet on vessels. We just can't spend a whole lot of time on vessels like I would like to because we spend more time on blood and the heart. So let's get started and begin by talking about what we find when we look at a sample of blood. So when you go to the doctor and they take blood from you, blood has certain components. First off, we need to know is blood is the only fluid tissue in the body. When we talk about blood, it is considered a tissue. And if you remember back to our tissues unit, we learned that blood is actually connective tissue because it comes from mesenchyme, it has cells, and it has a matrix with the blood plasma. So the blood cells are sometimes called formed elements, and they are suspended inside this non-living fluid matrix that we know of as plasma. Now, when you give that blood sample, no matter the size of the blood sample, whether it's just they prick your finger, or if they take a test tube, or they take 6 or 7 test tubes from you, that blood sample is basically going to break down the same way. 45% of the sample is going to be red blood cells, and red blood cells are known as erythrocytes. Now, where the red blood cells meet the plasma, you're going to see this thin little layer that forms there. That is known as the buffy coat. So it's just the junction between the red blood cells and the plasma. In that blood sample, you're also going to find white blood cells, which are known as leukocytes. But now white blood cells, they're not very numerous unless you have an infection. So in a normal blood sample, it's going to be less than 1% of that sample. That's sometimes why doctors will take a blood sample from you when you come to the doctor and you're sick. They want to see if you have a bacterial infection, a viral infection, and they can look, and if your numbers are above 1%, they know that you have some type of infection. You're also going to find less than 1%. It's going to be platelets, which are pieces of cells. So they're fragments of cells, and later we'll talk about what those platelets do. And then the remaining 55% is going to be plasma, which is that fluid portion of the blood. Now, blood has some very unique physical characteristics. One is it's sticky. Blood has a very sticky consistency, and when you taste it, and everybody's tasted blood before, you've lost a tooth or you've busted your lip, it has a salty taste, and that's because it has a metallic taste to it. Blood is scarlet red when it has a lot of oxygen, and then it turns a darker red, violet color when oxygen levels are poor. If you have surgery, sometimes when you go for your discharge to leave the hospital, they'll tell you that, bleeding is normal, but if you see bright red blood, you need to come back to the doctor because bright red blood is indicative of an arterial problem, and we don't want your arteries to be losing oxygenated blood. Your blood accounts for about 8% of your body weight. Males, of course, are going to have a little bit more blood because males have a bigger body. They have a bigger skeletal structure, whereas females are going to have about 4 to 5 of their body, 4 to 5 liters of their body being blood. Blood helps with 3 things: distribution, regulation, and protection. Distribution, the way that it helps is blood is responsible for delivering oxygen from your lungs and nutrients from the digestive tract to the rest of the body. It also picks up the waste products from the cells and takes those to where they need to go so those wastes can be eliminated from the body. And then another thing that it does is our blood picks up hormones. It takes hormones from endocrine organs and takes them to their target organs wherever they are in the body, because a lot of the endocrine organs are located in one spot, but the organ that needs that hormone is going to be in a completely different location. And so our blood picks that up for us as well. Regulation Our blood helps us maintain an appropriate body temperature. It also keeps our pH within a normal range. And finally, our blood helps us to maintain adequate fluid volume. And later, if we're able to get to the lymphatic system, we'll talk about how sometimes we lose volume in our blood. And so our lymphatic system is responsible for putting that back into the bloodstream. And then finally, we have protection. Our blood helps us by preventing blood loss. We have some very specific mechanisms to stop us from bleeding if we have some type of injury. And then also our blood is designed to prevent against infection. And of course, we know white blood cells help to fight infection. Now that matrix that we find the blood cells floating around in, it's a yellow sticky fluid. It's made mostly from water, but there are a lot of solutes dissolved in it and a lot of proteins. One protein is albumin. It's the same protein that's in egg whites. And we have a lot of that in our blood plasma. And its job is to help carry things through circulation, but it also is a blood buffer, which means it keeps the pH within a normal range. Our blood plasma is not a static content, though. It changes based on our diet, based on our environment. Our plasma may change by adding and removing substances. And also our blood plasma helps to distribute heat throughout the body. So we're going to take a few minutes and just spend some time looking at the different formed elements that are in our blood. So erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets. A couple things about them just in general, though. When we talk about those formed elements, there's really only one true cell, and those are the white blood cells or leukocytes. And that's because red blood cells don't have a nucleus. They lose their nucleus as they mature. Most of our formed elements can only survive for just a few days, and our blood cells do not divide. They're formed in the bone marrow, and so they don't go through mitosis. So let's start with erythrocytes, also known as the red blood cells. You're going to see me abbreviate red blood cells as RBCs just to save time. So when you look at a red blood cell, it's a little small flat disc, and it's got this little depressed center in the middle where the nucleus once was found. The contents of a red blood cell is basically just hemoglobin. It's just a little vesicle of hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is important because its job is to pick up oxygen. For every one hemoglobin, you can pick up 4 oxygens, and so you can get a lot of oxygen carrying capacity out of a red blood cell.
If anyone was planning to eat lunch today in the cafeteria, they are ready for you at this time. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So they pick up oxygen in the capillary bed of the lungs, and then it releases it to the tissue cells across the capillaries throughout the body. It transports about 20% of the carbon dioxide that our cells use up and our cells produce and takes it back to the lungs. The other 80% of carbon dioxide is used by the cells to make macromolecules and different things like that. Now, red blood cells have to move through some really tiny blood vessels, and the way that it does that is a protein known as spectrin. Spectrin allows red blood cells to bend, change shape, almost flatten themselves so that they can go through these teeny tiny little blood vessels without getting caught, which could cause a blood clot. Women typically have a lower red blood cell count than men, and that's because our bone structure is smaller. So therefore, we don't produce as much we don't have as much bone marrow, so therefore we don't make as many red blood cells. And finally, the thickness of our blood is affected by the number of red blood cells. The thicker your blood is, the more red blood cells that you're going to have. I do want to go back and look at hemoglobin just real quickly again and remind you, I put this in the notes just so that you would have it, 4 oxygens to every 1 hemoglobin. And our blood cells are made by hematopoiesis and the red bone marrow, And we did talk about that in the tissues section. So when our red blood cells are not in homeostatic balance, they're in homeostatic imbalance, we have some erythrocytic or erythrocyte disorders. The first one is known as anemia. Anemia is not a disease, it's a symptom of a disease. So if you have like a cough, we don't say, ooh, they've got the cough. We say you have a cough because you have the flu or because you have COVID. So there's an overlying disease that causes this symptom, and anemia is one of these symptoms. And basically what that means is that you have a low oxygen carrying capacity. So some different causes of anemia. One, you could just have an insufficient number of red blood cells. One, you could have lost blood through a hemorrhage, maybe a surgery or an accident, and you bled out. So therefore you lost a lot of blood in a very quick amount of time. And in that case, you may have to have a transfusion. We can have hemolytic anemia, which is where your body attacks your red blood cells prematurely and kills them. Some things that can cause that are infections. It could be that you have an abnormal hemoglobin that's formed and your body thinks it's an invader. And then also bad blood transfusions. And we'll talk about how we have to be very careful when we get a blood transfusion to make sure we get something that our body will be able to accept. And then the third cause of insufficient number of red blood cells is aplastic anemia. Aplastic anemia is typically caused by something that destroys your red bone marrow. It could be a bacteria, it could be medicine, it could be radiation. Individuals who are going through cancer treatments, a lot of times they'll develop aplastic anemia because they're just not making enough red blood cells. Another cause of anemia is decreased hemoglobin content. So there's several different ones. The first one is one that a lot of individuals get. It's just iron deficiency anemia. Usually because you're just not taking in enough iron in your diet. You're not eating properly. You're not making sure that you're eating from all the food groups and you're not eating iron-rich foods. And so iron deficiency anemia is really very common, especially if an individual has lost blood through a hemorrhage. If they're iron deficient on top of it, they'll see this decreased hemoglobin content. Athletes can develop a hemoglobin decrease because they exercise so much, and it causes their blood to dilute. And by doing that, because their blood volume expands and dilutes the amount of red blood cells within a sample, it causes them to have this decreased hemoglobin content. And then finally, we have pernicious anemia. Pernicious anemia is typically a deficiency of vitamin B12. We see this a lot of time in elderly individuals. B12, you don't take out the vitamin that you need in meats and poultry and fish, and so therefore it causes a decreased hemoglobin content. So a lot of times individuals who have pernicious anemia will have to take a B12 supplement. And finally, you may just have abnormal hemoglobin. These are typically inherited disorders. Thalassemia is an inherited disorder that we see of individuals that have a Mediterranean ancestry. So we see it a lot in individuals from Italy or Greece. And what happens is they produce very, very, very delicate red blood cells. And those delicate red blood cells don't have enough hemoglobin, and they're very fragile. And so therefore they don't have enough iron carrying capacity. And then the second one, sickle cell anemia, this one's pretty common as far as being studied in biology. I know it's one thing that you talk a lot about in biology when you discuss Punnett squares. But sickle cell anemia is a genetic disorder that's passed down that causes you to produce hemoglobin that is improperly formed. And so instead of your red blood cells being able to bend and move through vessels, instead they will get hung up, and it causes you to have blood clots form. And an individual with sickle cell who's in crisis will be in extreme pain because of all the little blood clots that form. Now, what's interesting is sickle cell anemia was actually an evolutionary adaptation for individuals who were found in the malaria belt of Africa. If you lived in the malaria belt of Africa, you were more likely to get sick from malaria and die of malaria. And so this is an evolutionary adaptation that formed because if you have sickle cell, you can't get malaria. Now, of course, now we can easily treat malaria, so we would rather you not have sickle cell. And so doctors have come up with ways to do genetic counseling for individuals who may potentially have sickle cell that runs in their family. And then one other erythrocytic disorder that we see is called polycythemia. And this one's kind of on the flip side of anemia. Polycythemia translates to too many blood cells. So you have way too many red blood cells, so it makes your blood extremely thick. And this can be a problem because it can lead to blood clots, heart damage, strokes. And so we usually treat this with blood dilution. Either you donate blood, or in some cases, they'll give you plasma. Now, blood doping, this is a way of using polycythemia artificially. So what happens is individuals who are athletes, they will sometimes have someone draw blood from their body over a period of time, and they take that blood and they store it. And then just before they're in some type of
Teachers, at this time, we will release our bus riders to the bus. Thank you.
some type of athletic competition, then they will reinsert that blood, lift their oxygen carrying capacity, and it gives them an unfair advantage. We're going to stop there, and the next lecture will be on white blood cells.